Hey everyone, thanks for dropping in. This is Pastor Danny, and this is Elisha's Bears, a podcast. Thank you for being here today, and I appreciate your following the podcast. I'm very excited to have Reverend Dr. Meredith Stone with us today. She has been a contributor to CNN and New York Times and NPR and Washington Post. That's not an exhaustive list, and she's currently serving as Executive Director for Baptist Women in Ministry. And Meredith, we were talking about this a moment ago. Obviously, we've seen each other. We kind of have this similar orbit as far as denominations are concerned, but thank you for being here.
Yeah, so glad. Thanks for inviting me.
I was reading a press release when you were first hired, and to be more specific, when you were hired as CEO of Baptist Women in Ministry. Okay. You said, "I am thrilled for the opportunity to lead Baptist Women in Ministry and expanding its impact to more women, congregations, organizations, and partners, because when women are fully valued in the church, the work of God can be more fully realized in the world." So 5+ years later, are you still thrilled? And how is it going?
It's been a great journey these last 5 years. We've had so much opportunity. Sadly, I've told folks whenever bad things happen really publicly, that gives social justice organizations the opportunity to have our message heard. And so, since the Southern Baptist Convention has been so loud about women in ministry during a good portion of these last 5 years, it has given us an opportunity to spread the word and to do more ministry in congregations and to support more women. So we've been busy trying to find ways to really start to knock down some walls.
And that's kind of maybe the unintended impact, and I've observed that. I'm not sure when I saw this, but there was this T-shirt or sweatshirt that says, "This is what a preacher looks like," and I don't
Mhm.
know why I just used air quotes. Nobody's gonna see that except you. Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, those came out in 2007, I believe. So this was before my tenure. There was a campaign around that time. Gosh, that's almost 20 years ago.
That's what I'm saying. It's had a lot of staying power, though.
It has. There was a campaign that was "This is what a feminist looks like," that was going around at the time, and so, the leadership of BWIM adapted that to "This is what a preacher looks like," and there was something about that message that just really stuck with people, and I think there's power in the visuals. When you can see something, you recognize the dissonance that people were creating between a woman wearing a T-shirt that said, "This is what a preacher looks like." And I think that helped, again, get the word out and people to start to make some connections.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of your education. You got your bachelor's and master's from Hardin-Simmons, and you have a Ph.D. from Brite Divinity School, which I would imagine is not an easy get. Have been the dean and professor of scripture and ministry at Logsdon Seminary. How did that work prepare you or maybe help you with what you're doing now?
Yeah, my research in biblical interpretation was using imperial critical methods, which is an intersection of several different kinds of methods, essentially to think about how does power get exerted, and then how is power negotiated by those who are sitting under power and oppressed by it. And so I would read biblical texts with those frameworks from a variety of fields. So when I came into this work, that same framework has guided the way that I've thought about what we do. When I see things that are happening, I'm thinking about the various structures of power and how they are being exerted. And then applying those negotiation methods in how women and men are thinking about living in the church where patriarchy has still been pervasive for so many years, and we're in that transition period for many of us of trying to figure out how do we continue to move forward in it. So I think my education served me actually pretty well for this job. Didn't expect that was where it would go, but turned out it worked okay.
Well, let's pick up on that last sentence when you said not expecting where you have ended up or where you are now. Can you talk a little bit about your call to ministry? Maybe that's a core memory for all of us as ministers. When was that, and what do you recall about it? And what do you think it means to be called?
Yeah. What do you think it means to be called? We can all write some books on that. I felt called at 17. I started thinking about it, but then had one of those experiences where I felt like God's presence was with me and guiding me. One of those moments that you really just can't deny that God is working within you. And so wasn't sure what that meant as a 17-year-old girl in Southern Baptist Church. It took a while, but after 6 months or so, I finally went forward as we did often those days to share that sense of call. And when I went forward and talked to my pastor, he looked at me and said, "Okay, why don't you go sit back down and we'll talk about this in my office later next week." As where I'd seen my male friends, peers, soon as they went forward, of course, they're presented to the church,
Oh, yeah.
licensed within a month, preaching
Yeah.
their first sermon on Sunday night. I got to have a sit down talk with the pastor in his office, which for some of us, when we're told you can't do something, it gives us a little motivation to figure out, can I? I had a little bit of that spirit to go, I don't know if I believe you over what I have sensed from God. And so it sent me on a journey that probably took 10 years to really embrace I can be called and there are no limits to what I can do.
So you had this, and I think that's something. I thought that's probably in some of the reading I've done about your life story that happened, and you're thinking, "This is not what I'm expecting." You're a teenager, so you had that initial discouraging thing right out of the gate. But how have you been encouraged? Have there been mentors
Yeah.
along the way to affirm your calling? I'm sure there have been.
Absolutely. I have had, even in churches that were not fully affirming of women in all ministry roles, I had these great ministry opportunities as a college student and as a seminary student to be able to exercise my gifts. And looking back, even though there were limitations, I've been able to take the gifts that I was given from those places and really see how they helped prepare me for what was next. And like many of us, my seminary professors were just unmatched in the encouragement that they gave me. I don't know that I would have felt empowered to even try to do some of the things that I had done if I didn't have seminary professors who were cheering me on, and one who was an interim pastor at a tiny Presbyterian church of 12 people, and he would get me to go out whenever he wasn't there, and you would have to say the liturgies, preach the sermon, say all the prayers, lead the singing. You would just stand there and do the whole thing. And so I got to have opportunities to try things out and was really encouraged by those professors.
Well, before we got started a few minutes ago, you were telling me that you're serving as an interim pastor right now.
Mhm.
And so, since we're on the topic of preaching, let's talk about your first sermon. All
Yeah.
right. I understand that after your first sermon, and I'm going to be quoting you several times, so just get used to that. You preached and you sat down and you said, "I had an overwhelming sense that I'm doing something God wanted me to do," and that's a sensation that I would imagine you want all women to have, and really men
Yeah,
too. But that's something that you want everyone to experience.
absolutely. And to even have the opportunity to try it so that you know it's not what God called you to do, you know? So much of how we understand, in my opinion, who we are and what God is doing in our lives comes from how we are experiencing things, how we're experiencing God at work. And my hope would be every woman would have the opportunity, if she felt like there might be a sense of call that included preaching, to give it a try and to see how it felt, to give it a try to go into a hospital room as the pastor, to give it a try to preach or teach on Wednesday nights, teach a Bible study so that that can be a part of her discernment is to actually have experiences.
I wanted to mention it because that really resonated with me to have this sense. And it's hard to describe that. It's just a sense that, hey, I'm doing what God wants me to do. And with your role now as the CEO of Baptist Women in Ministry, let's just briefly touch on some of the trajectory that it's been on the last several decades. It started in the early 80s. BWim has obviously gone through some changes, but has there been a constant in terms of the organization about its mission, maybe its target audience or purpose?
Yeah. When we look at the initial purpose statement that was written in 1983, and our organization was originally founded for Southern Baptist women, but that purpose statement had to do with providing support for women who feel the call to be in ministry. And I think that theme has carried throughout, recognizing that in a field in which that has been predominantly male throughout history, women needed some extra support We needed to have friends who understood what we were going through. We needed to have that little boost of, hey, yes, I'm experiencing that too. Here's how I'm navigating it. The kinds of equipping that we do for folks in those situations, a lot of times the education we might get in practical ministry has been shaped by the male experience because that was what was most common. But then when women are having different experiences, sometimes even how we're trained to minister wasn't lining up with some of what we had gotten from our education. So that aspect of supporting women, making sure that women had a place where they knew their calling was believed, where they know that they're seen and they're heard and they matter whenever they might be experiencing just compounding sense of obstacles and rejection in some other places.
Well, along those lines, and that was kind of leading me to the next thought I had. Obviously, we're 2026. I'm finally putting the six on the end
It's
now. But do you find that women ministers are they still starting? This is a generalization, of course, in more of an apologetic position as far as their calling is concerned in Baptist churches, or can you simply start by saying I belong here, or do you find there are still places and situations where you're having to kinda make a case for,
yeah.
people who don't think you belong.
Yeah. I think it's situational. And, some of the churches that are maybe early on in their process of saying, you know what, we have changed our theology about women and we want to encourage women. There might be more of a sense of that. As we're churches which are a little bit further along, maybe 30, 40, 50 years past making that change theologically, it might be more subtle. We did a survey 5 years ago now in 2021 where we were asking women about the obstacles that they experienced. And it was a lot of the microaggressions that were scoring really high. So those more subtle things. The highest one being 72% of, and this was of 455 Baptist women in ministry, 72% said they have to provide more evidence of their competence than their male counterparts. And I've experienced that to be true just in my experiences with my colleagues of if I mess up, it's taken almost as a complete affront to my whole gender. Well, this is why you don't work with women. Or the fact that, and this is something I've heard a lot from search committees and folks where they will say, this woman is the best preacher that we have ever heard. So, of course, we believe in women in ministry. And when we do that, we say, well, you have to be the best that we've ever heard in order for us to believe in women in ministry, rather than saying, we simply believe God called you. Not every man who is a preacher is the best preacher who has ever preached. But we believe his call without question. A woman has to be the best preacher ever for her to have the opportunity, and for those churches to get on board. So I think there's of where those things come in, and from subtle to maybe more
Okay,
overt at times.
I was gonna get to this a little bit later, but since we're on this topic now, one of the things you said was, too often women who are hired out of seminary are expected to be perfect in ways that women are not. You touched on that. What do you mean by that? And what are some things women ministers deal with that men do not have to deal with, and how are they
Yeah,
treated differently?
yeah. Um, whenever I first kind of got in the women in ministry circles, I had accepted my call. A lot of the conferences and books that I read and things that I heard people say always talked about, okay, you're judged more harshly. Women, we have to be excellent. We have to be better if they are going to believe us. We have to have more education. We have to be better prepared to simply be believed and respected. And I had a seminary student, which I was serving in college ministry at the time and part time at the seminary. And I was talking to her about this, and she said, Meredith, I hear you saying that I need to be better, but also I just really want to be me and be a minister. And I'm not perfect. Oh, that got me. That was when I realized all of the bias still, pervades even me, and very well-meaning people who are saying you have to be better. So I think that's part of the challenge that women face.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's not even related to your calling. It's more of a
yeah,
performance, isn't it?
exactly. Yeah. Another one of those. challenges that women often face. And I hate to be too clear about this, but everybody will know what I mean. When a woman is being decisive and taking leadership, she often gets called a word that rhymes with witch rather than being seen as an effective leader. And some of that just goes into our cultural conditioning where we associate certain characteristics with men, even though they don't necessarily mean that they're men. And we associate certain characteristics with a leader, and those tend to line up with the ones we characterize with men. And then when we do the same thing with women and leader, there's a conflict. Women are supposed to be gentle and humble and nurturing. And so whenever we do what we're asked to do by a congregation and lead, it's not always perceived as easily and accepted as readily as it is for our male counterparts.
And constantly having to show those skills and then be questioned by it.
Yeah, and then yeah, it's this balance. If anybody's seen the Barbie movie, she goes in this long dialogue, which I think is absolutely true. To walk that line between when we're too collaborative and asking people to be involved in our decision making, then we're seen as too weak to make decisions. Well, she's just a woman; she needs all of us to help her. But then when we are too decisive, we get called those names of, oh, she's so and assertive. So it's a hard balance to find whenever really we just want to be ourselves, who God created us to be, and live that out in ministry just like anyone else.
Well, I want to be clear to the listeners that you and I did not rehearse this because you mentioned the Barbie movie. I appreciate that because it ties into this book I read not too long ago by Dr. Beth Allison Barr called Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And she was tracing the role of pastor's wife and how it has been, I'm going to say, and again, this is a reference to Southern Baptist life, and because still that denomination still is so influential in
Uh-huh.
some ways, but she talked about how that role has been used to either undermine or replace
Uh,
women's ordination and ministerial roles. And I was curious, do you have any reaction to that, or does that ever come up in the circles that you operate in?
yeah. Yeah. Beth is right here in Waco where I live. She and I've got to know each other. Her work has been so important, I think. Yeah.
But I'd love to have her on the show.
Yeah, I think she has done something in being able to provide a very accessible entry point for a lot of people into this discussion that has widened the opportunity to be able to have those conversations. I'm so grateful for that. In this latest book about the pastor's wife, and I think that it's important for us to note, Beth is a pastor's wife.
Exactly.
And she is so involved in the ministry of their church. And so in no way was this an undermining of the role of a pastor spouse. This was her seeing how she was kind of forced into that role rather than being given the choice. And then did this research to see how that rise of the role of a spouse, the great 2-for-1 offer where people think if I hire this pastor, then I get their spouse and all of their time for free. And all of that has created another obstacle for women who do feel that call, in that they're trying to find ways to be seen in a variety of roles and not just, for example, I can't tell you how many women that I talk to that they say when they first felt called, they were told by some well meaning person in their church, honey, that's wonderful. You're going to make such a great pastor's wife. And it's just kind of an assumed picture. So yeah, I think Beth's work has been very important. And I do not think in any way it undermines the role of a pastor spouse, but is helping to see that women need opportunities to choose what their ministry looks like and not just being forced into one.
Yeah. You're obviously, and along those lines, you're the CEO of this organization. It includes women, but the first word is Baptist. And you mentioned the movie. Let me mention a song. All right. Paul Simon, Still Crazy After All These Years, maybe a few years back. So he's talking about still crazy after all these years. Why are you still Baptist after
Yeah.
all these years? Are there some distinctives that, I mean, we maybe have grown up Southern Baptist and we can have some appreciation for that. But Meredith, what keeps you Baptist?
Yeah. The a little rebel in me would say, why should I be the one that has to leave?
Okay.
This is who I am.
Okay.
But I think there are, gosh, I love our Baptist distinctives. The idea of soul freedom, of church freedom, the ways in which we empower all people, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of soul freedom, the priesthood of all believers. That can be such a foundational aspect for us to build upon in empowering all people for ministry. I think as Baptists, we are situated better than most with our theology to be able to recognize the call of any person as valid. And yet, somehow, things have gotten in the way of that happening. I appreciate my Baptist upbringing probably more than some, but I see the ways in which, even as a child, I was being equipped for ministry. So many of us talk about, our experience in GAs, but it wasn't until we got to being older and actually wanting to do what they told us to do that, oh, wait, we didn't actually mean that. We didn't really mean that you should go and minister in that way. But yeah, so I think that there is a space for Baptists to continue to evolve. It's not a calling. I also am very intentional to celebrate and bless those who feel they need to leave. It's not the same for all of us. I may feel the call to stay and to continue to have these conversations. Others may need to leave for their well being, for the ways in which they feel they need to express their ministry at this point in their life. So we bless them and we say, shame on Baptists for not keeping you. We're going to work so that the next generation might stay.
But there's, to your point, there's been a lot of, for lack of a better word, talent that
Yeah,
we have missed out on
absolutely.
as a result of that. You hinted at this earlier, kind of going back to local church ministry. There seems to be a gap between churches who say they support women in ministry and the churches that would actually consider or call a woman as lead pastor. What do you make of that? And can a church say they support women in ministry without considering hiring a woman for the lead pastor position?
Yeah. I think there is a unique hurdle in senior leadership. And we've seen that as churches have some Baptist churches have become more open to women in ministry. It's easier for them to move into associate positions and staff positions. And we celebrate every woman who is called to those positions and has an opportunity to do that. We don't think every woman needs to be moving towards senior pastor. Sometimes people think that way of like senior pastor is the ultimate goal for everybody. The ultimate goal for everybody is to minister as God has called them to and to not have obstacles to being able to do that. But there are women who have been called to senior leadership. I think the gap is in both the theological, the patriarchal structures that have become embedded in our churches, but also the cultural and societal constructions of what leadership look like that have been getting in the way that leadership takes place at the senior pastor level. As far as your question of can a church be supportive of women in ministry and not be open to calling a woman a senior pastor? I think, one way I might ask the question is to reverse it and say, can a church be supportive of men in ministry and not be open to calling a man as their senior pastor? I think they can. However, I would hope that congregations who were supportive could get to that place of trying to remove the barriers that have been constructed by people to being able to hear God's Spirit lead them to whomever God's Spirit might. I don't know that it has been, so people say, God couldn't have been calling women because women haven't been serving. I think that we have constructed barriers to being able to hear God's Spirit directing our churches to empower women. And so, whatever path a church takes, I would hope that they would want to do the work to remove those barriers and let the Spirit move them to call whomever they might choose, whether that be a man or a woman. We want the Spirit to be able to work as fully and freely as it.
Well, that's going to be a good segue to the state of women in Baptist life. But before I get there, I want to maybe something completely different. Do you have any thoughts on the Billy Graham rule?
Mm.
And also thoughts about clergy and sexual abuse in the church? Does this relate to the work that you're doing? But let me maybe the first part of that question.
Uh, uh, one
Because
of the
it relates to that these roles that you're talking about.
Yeah. One of the first articles that I wrote for the Baptist Standard when I was starting to be more public in my speaking about women in ministry was about the Billy Graham rule. And I got waylaid for that. I think what the Billy Graham rule has done is to say that those who are even, let's say, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, right? If 90% of the pastors are men, if they can't mentor on a one-on-one basis women, and we're leaving 10% of the pastors to mentor all of the women in ministry who might feel called to pastor, we've limited their opportunity to be able to receive that kind of training and equipping that comes so much from those one-on-one relationships. I think it is wise for pastors to put up protections for themselves and others, but if within the protections that are appropriate to your context, I think there should always be opportunities for men to be able to have conversations with women, especially in that way of mentoring. And I do think that has been a factor that has kept women from being able to move forward.
Yeah.
A lot of times, whenever
Mhm.
churches are looking for pastors, they're asking around, who do you know? Can you recommend some folks to us? And who are you going to recommend? Your friends. And if the men who are predominantly still the pastors in churches don't even have those close relationships to know women one on one, how are they going to recommend women to churches? So, all that to say, I think the Billy Graham rule needs to be thrown out. I do not think we need to throw out appropriate boundaries for any and all of our relationships. But when we say men can't have one on one conversations with women, what we're doing is we are sexually objectifying women to say all she is a sexual object. She's not a minister and a person. Yeah. So I have feelings about that.
Yeah, I can tell. I can tell that. Kinda taking it a kind of a slightly different direction, it seemed like we just read about, Philip Yancey,
Mm.
and it just seemed like and of course, in Texas, it just seems like there's mega church pastors
Oh,
and
yeah.
clergy and sexual abuse. Any thoughts about how with your work and your ministry, have you had a role in maybe being helpful, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, Baptist Women Ministry partnered with Cooperative Baptist Fellowship in 2016 to produce some clergy sexual misconduct resources, and we've continued to be a partner in that. But much of that work has shifted to CBF. We still try to function as a place where women can call and reach out and know that they will be believed. So we don't handle any of the investigations or any of those kinds of things, but we know that women have a tendency to make the call to a place that they trust and they know that they are going to be respected. And so we do take some of those calls and then have to help figure out how to navigate that with churches. I think that the through line in these pieces um, is the structures through which patriarchy gets exerted in our congregations. Jay Keevy and I did a presentation this summer for Baptist professors of religion in which we kind of went through this whole picture of when patriarchy is being exerted in economic, ideological, political, all of these different ways. What winds up happening is that women are put in a vulnerable position, and sometimes the men who are experiencing that do not have full recognition of the privilege and power that they are exerting in situations. And it can lead to inequity in power, tends to lead to abuses of power. And what we have to do is constantly be working toward how do we make sure that those who do have a power imbalance understand and promote the continual development of empathy. I read a book that talked about, I never can remember the name of the book. It talked about how when you have a lot of power and influence, that literally there is a neural pathway in your brain that normally leads to empathy, which makes you a good leader. But that power and influence starts to turn off that neural pathway that makes empathy easy. Because in power, you're having to make decisions without, always, sometimes it's going to hurt these people. And so empathy gets turned off. So we have to constantly be working on making sure that pathway toward empathy is practiced, encouraged, celebrated when it's used. And I think that can be a great tool that those who are in power can use to make sure that they don't wind up going down the road of abuses.
Well, I'm glad to hear you talk about empathy because it just seems like I don't know if it's just recently, but empathy has been interpreted as a weakness of
Mm,
some kind, but empathy is really integral
yes.
to, who we are.
And it makes us great leaders, right? Understanding what people need and how they feel helps us make good decisions as leaders. And as soon as, if that gets turned off in service of protecting leadership and protecting the organization over connecting with the people, I think that's where the difficulty comes in.
Well, a lot of what you do, and I would imagine a lot of what BWIM does, is in the area of advocacy or encouraging women and really churches in general. And I mentioned it a moment ago, the State of Women in Baptist Life was released in 2025. Can you tell us what that is and why it's important?
Yeah, we started releasing this report 20 years ago in 2005. We've come to a place where it's released about every 4 or 5 years. It includes some statistics that have been kept since the beginning of Baptist Women in Ministry. One of those is the number of women serving as senior pastors in various denominational groups. Another is the percentage of seminary students in moderate Baptist seminaries that are women, as well as percentage of endorsed chaplains that are women. And those are statistics that we've kept consistently. And then the report always includes another aspect of research that we are working on at the time. And so in this recent report, the aspect of research that we were working on really stemmed from the last report, as we had noticed in asking women about the obstacles that they were experiencing. They were experiencing those at a high rate. For example, women at 86% of women in ministry said they experienced obstacles to their ministry because of their gender. And yet also 87% of the same people said that their churches were affirming of women in ministry. And so there was some sort of gap that was happening between affirmation and removing obstacles. So we tried to reverse our perspective on that and to look from an asset basis and go, okay, in churches where women are thriving, what can we see to be the common attributes, the common markers of those churches, so that those might be able to inform churches in their move from affirmation to women thriving without obstacles. And so we released those and had 6 different markers that were part of that. We still have research that's ongoing and trying to refine those and think more carefully about how we can measure them in churches and maybe provide a measurement where a church can go, okay, we're here and we want to be here. Here are the steps that we can take to get there.
They're benchmarks, pretty much.
Exactly, exactly. So that's on the kind of micro level of congregations. And then as we looked at those bigger statistics on the macro level, honestly, we continue to see great progress in some of the Baptist denominations that are supportive of women in ministry. For Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, between 2021 to 2025, the number of women serving as senior pastors of CBF congregations moved from 105 to 142. That's like a 35% jump in the total number, and the percentage of CBF congregations went from 7.4 to 10%. 2.6% increase may not seem like a lot, but whenever you've looked at the long term, there's long term slow growth. This was a jump in rate of growth for us. And to get into double digits, we really hope for CBF congregations will be an encouragement that this is becoming more common and that there are congregations who have seen growth and seen exciting opportunities for ministry with women in the lead. Too often I hear from congregations or congregants, if we hire a woman as a senior pastor, through every church we've seen that's done that, their attendance has declined, their giving has fallen off, their church is dying. And my first response to that is always to say, you don't know all the women in ministry who are pastoring, because there are churches that are growing and thriving that women are leading right now. And it's really exciting to see.
When you look down the road, still staying with the report, where are we with in theological education as
Yeah,
far as men and women? Yeah, go ahead and go with that.
it, at the master's level, in the 21 report, we were just over 50% female in master's level enrollment. And now we grew a little bit more to where it's about 52% of enrollment is women. The DMin level is not quite as high for Doctor of Ministry. In 2021, that was at 25% of enrollment was women. So it was interesting the disparity between master's level and Doctor of Ministry level, and demonstrated that there were some obstacles for women to get that next level of education that weren't present at the master's level. But that number increased to 37% in 2025. So we saw a lot of those obstacles apparently being worked on by our seminaries, by congregations, in the ways in which they approach that. But I think, when we look at those numbers, when we see 52% of master's level seminary students are women, and then we compare those numbers to clergy leadership, that's where maybe again that gap stands in place. You would hope that in every aspect of ministry, chaplains, associate ministers, missionaries, organizational leaderships, and senior pastors, that it would match, right? That we would be at 50% all the way across. And it just kind of goes to show we want to figure out how to remove the obstacles for women to move from seminary enrollment into the ministry that they feel God has called them to.
Well, progress takes time.
Yes, it
And
does.
I have 2 daughters that are in their 20s, and it's just interesting to listen to them. Of course, they were raised in a pastor's home and in a church. Do you find that talking to the women who are in their early 20s or 30s, I'm kind of a certain age now. I kind of was a product of Southern Baptist life, but a lot of these stories and, different battles that we talk about, they are
Hmm.
unfamiliar with. They're starting from a different place, aren't they, as far as their service to the Lord?
Yeah. Women who are being raised in more moderate churches are definitely starting at a different place. Interestingly, about 10 or 15 years ago when I was working in women in ministry, and also I wasn't teaching at the time, but I was getting to know a lot of the women who were in some of our moderate seminaries in Texas. I was working for Texas Baptist. There was a disconnect that was happening for those women in that they had grown up in these churches that had said they affirmed women in every single way. And then they got to seminary and they realized, wait, I don't have the same opportunities as my male counterparts. And yet I was told from the time that I was born that I was fully valued by God and the church and could be called to any kind of ministry. And then they would experience this all of a sudden, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? This block as they came up to seeking out those opportunities. And for some of them, discouraged them to the point of wanting to step away from ministry altogether. For others, they had to recalibrate to understand that there's a lot that goes on in the ways in which churches are calling ministers, and they're the majority of Baptist churches. When you're looking for a job and you just put out, I want to serve at a Baptist church, the majority of Baptist churches are still more patriarchal than others. At any given point, if a person, a church says, we want someone for this position who has 10 years of experience in Baptist context. If that's all they say, you've probably got tens of thousands of men who qualify and far less women. And so that disparity of opportunity continues to exist. But we're working on changing that. We're gonna keep doing it as long as it takes.
I got you for a few more minutes. I want to kind of bring it back to where we started a few moments ago, which was your call. And you talked about, 17 years old, sensing a call to ministry. I believe in one of your writings, you said your youth minister was supportive, and then you went up to the front, and the pastor told you you may need to think
Yeah.
about this a little bit more. But when you think about your call to ministry at that age and your education, in your academic life and you work in a local church and now you're the head of Baptist Women in Ministry. Just two parts. First of all, has the journey been worth it? And what do you know now that you didn't know when you got started, when you were, if you can remember being in that church and going
Mhm.
up to the front? What have you learned along the way?
Yeah, it's definitely been worth it. There have definitely been heartbreak, I think is a good word for it, that I've experienced deep hurt and heartbreak along the way. But more than that, I have experienced the fulfilling opportunity of being able to do what God called me to do, which makes it worth it for me. And I never want to speak for anyone else. I think I've learned along the way that one, you do learn a lot. I think at 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, we all thought we knew everything that there was to know about God and faith and leadership and why won't everybody just listen to me? I think the farther along I get, the more I realize the less I know and how excited I am to continue on the journey of growth, of developing my relationship with Christ, of understanding what it looks like to minister in people in different ways. So maybe the thing I've learned the most is how much I don't know. Um, And maybe a second thing that I've learned is the place for doubt in ministry. I feel like the times in which I have experienced the deep and pain and grief of life, and that it led me into questions about my faith. On the other side of that, I feel like I've been a much better minister because I've been able to make space for grief and doubt and to see ministry as walking alongside people more than teaching them what they need to know. It's a making space for us to grow together, to think together, to be together. So yeah, those aren't very concrete, but I think off the cuff, those are the things I would say maybe I've learned the most.
No, I think that's great, and that's kind of been some thoughts that I've had recently because we're not there yet, right? And
Yeah,
I just think the beauty of it is we don't have to know everything to minister. Just one or two other thoughts. What would you say to women? I think you mentioned this as you talked about not having to tell people, but listen and walk with them. For women who are sensing a call to ministry, maybe men too.
yeah,
What would you say to encourage them
yeah.
in their service and their path ahead?
Yeah. And like you mentioned, we all need people who will walk with us on this journey. The triune God, the God who is three in one, has shown us what community is, right? That we are not alone. Even God, in God's oneness, is not alone. And we need the community to be able to walk together in this journey. I think my encouragement to women and men is for them to know that while there are challenges to ministry, while it is hard, there is a beauty in getting to be a part of what God is doing in the world in this way. There's beauty of getting to be a part of what God is doing in the world in so many other ways and participating in making the world a better place. But getting to be with people in their deep hurts, getting to walk alongside people as they experience faith and what it's like to move forward in a world that is not always amenable to faith. There's so much beauty there that we get to experience in ministry that it's worth it. It really is worth it.
I'm gonna get you out of here on this one because when we got started and before we started recording this, when we were talking about some of the things we wanted to talk about, you said we could spend 3 hours
Oh yeah,
doing this. And for the record, I'm getting us out of here before that. For
it's
those
good.
who want, for the people who want to know more about you or Baptist Women in Ministry or both, where do they go to find that?
Yeah, our website is www.bwim.info. You can learn more about our ministry there and sign up for our newsletter to see all of the things that we are doing, programs that offer support to women who are pursuing ministry, and initiatives and advocacy in a variety of ways. And if you want to know more about the beginnings of our organization, I'd encourage you to find the documentary film that we produced just a couple of years ago called Midwives of a Movement.
Oh, that's really good. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. We were so honored to receive the Best Documentary Award from the Louisville International Film Festival a couple of years ago for that. And it's a great piece of storytelling and is a good way to be introduced to the work of Baptist women in ministry.
Any final thoughts that I may have left out or any burning questions?
Just thank you for wanting to have a conversation about this. Thank you for your leadership in supporting women in ministry. We need more pastors of every generation who are making space for this conversation. So I'm grateful for you.
Meredith, it's been a pleasure talking to you face to face, and we have been listening to Reverend Dr. Meredith Stone, the Chief Executive Officer of Baptist Women in Ministry. And until next time, thanks for listening.